We're going to create a neckline with a flat collar. So a flat collar is a collar that lies flat against the garment in both the front of the garment and the back of the garment. So the shape of the collar is the exact same shape as the garment itself, which allows it to lie flat. With our sample, we're going to do a flat collar that is rounded edges, and we're going to do a flat collar that has pointed edges as well. With a collar, when you apply a collar to a garment, you have to finish the neckline in some way to hide your seam allowance as you apply your collar. We are going to do a collar that is finished with a neck facing. If we did not use a neck facing, our other options for finishing the neckline when applying the collar would be that we could apply a bias binding to the wrong side of the garment that would encase the neckline seam allowance, or we could have a garment that has a lining in the inside of the garment that would hide or finish off the neckline and hide the seam allowance of the collar. To make the collars, you're going to need bodice front pattern piece number 1, bodice back pattern piece number 2 out of the yellow pattern pieces. You're going to need the pointed flat collar piece number 13. You're going to need the curved flat collar piece number 14. And you will need the back neck facing piece number 6, front neck facing piece number 5. You will also need the collar pieces 13 and 14 out of the interfacing that are blue, and you'll need interfacing for piece number 5 and piece number 6, your front and back neck facings. To attach the collars to our bodice, we're going to be working in the neck area. So since we're working in the neck area, we don't have to do the darts in our samples. What we need to do is we need to sew at the shoulder seams. We need to sew the bodice back to the bodice front. So take your bodice front, which should be cut on the fold, and lay it right side up. And we're going to put our bodice backs right side down on top of that, matching up the shoulder seams. So our center back should be on top of the center front. We know that it's center back because it has a double notch in it. We're going to match up the notches at the shoulder seams and match up the edge of the fabric. We're going to pin that. And we're going to do that for both shoulder seams. To sew the shoulder seams, we're going to use a 1/4 inch seam allowance. So we're going to line up the edge of our fabric with the edge of our presser foot. We're going to use a regular stitch length and a plain seam. So we're going to back stitch. And then we're going to sew across the shoulder seam. When we get to the other side, we're going to back stitch. We're going to do the same thing for the other shoulder seam. So again, 1/4 inch seam allowance, the edge of the presser foot. We're going to back stitch. We're going to sew across the shoulder seam. When we get to the edge, we're going to back stitch. We've sewn the shoulder seams. Now we need to press those flat. So we're going to take them, we're going to open them up and press those. We're going to do that to both shoulder seams. We need to prepare the collars and the facings by applying interfacing to each of those. So we will take the collars, and you should have 2 round collars and 2 pointed collars. Go ahead and open those up, wrong side up, and then apply the interfacing to those collars. And you need to make the collars slightly different shapes, so make sure that you place the interfacing on the right piece of the collar. So make sure that it matches the collar. You can match the notches with that as well. Make sure you put the rough side of the interfacing facing the wrong side of the collar. And then you're going to apply that to the facing with the iron. So we'll do that to both collars. And then we'll do the same thing to the facings. So your neck facing should be one facing. It should be cut on the fold. So you can go ahead and open that up, wrong side up. And then you should have 2 back neck facing pieces. So you can go ahead and apply your interfacing to those, just like we did to the collars. So I should have interfacing on my facings and on my collars. So with our collars, we have the pointed collar and we have the round collar. In your garment, if you were making a garment, you would have 2 pointed collars that would go like this, one for the left side and one for the right side. Or you would have 2 round collars, one for the left and one for the right. But for our samples, we're going to do, on one side we're going to do the pointed collar, and on the other side we're going to do the round collar. So with a collar, we have what we call the upper collar and the lower collar. So the lower collar is going to be when we have it laying on our garment. The upper collar is going to be the side of the collar that you see. The lower collar would be the side that is underneath that would lay next to the garment. And the reason that we have that is because we need to finish the raw edges of our collar. And so we do that by sewing an upper collar to a lower collar. If we were only going to have one layer of collar, we would have to finish the edges of our collar. That could be done with, if you had a lace collar, your lace would have a finished edge, so you could only use one layer of a collar. Or if you did a bound collar, where you actually enclose the raw edges in some type of binding, you can also do a single layer collar. So for our sample, we're going to take our collar and we're going to put our upper collar and our lower collar together, right sides together, and we're going to pin down the side, the bottom, and this side. The round part at the top with the notch, we're going to leave that open. We're not going to sew that section shut. So with my collar being ready to be sewn, I should have right sides out, which means that I should be able to see the interfacing when the pattern pieces are laid together. So again, right sides together, interfacing out, and we're going on the round collar, we're going to sew around the large curved edge. To sew the upper collar to the under collar on the pointed collar, we're going to start at what would be the neckline. We're going to sew down the edge. When we get to the edge, we're going to pivot. We're going to sew around the curved part. When we get to the edge, we're going to pivot, and we're going to sew back up to the neck. We're going to do that with a 1/4 of an inch seam allowance. Okay. So we're going to line up the edge of the collar with the edge of the presser foot. We're going to back stitch. We get to the corner, we're going to lift our presser foot. We're going to turn our collar to pivot. We're going to put our presser foot back down. Now we're going to slightly turn the collar as we're sewing to keep the edge of the collar at a 1/4 of an inch seam allowance as we sew around the curved portion of the collar. When we get to the edge, we're going to lift up our presser foot, turn the fabric, put our presser foot back down so that we can pivot, and sew up the other side of the collar. When we get to the edge, we're going to back stitch. So we've stitched around our pointed collar. The top curve, which is going to be applied to our neck of our garment, is left unstitched. So what we're going to do now is we're going to cut at a corner. We're going to cut a diagonal and remove the excess seam allowance because we're going to turn our collar right side out. And as we do that, we want to cut out the corners so that we remove the bulk of the seam allowance when we turn it right side out. So we want to trim at a diagonal close to the seam, but make sure you don't actually cut the seam. Then the other thing we want to do is, because this is a curve and the seam allowance is actually larger in the curve than our actual where we stitched our collar, we need to notch around that curve to remove the excess bulk of the seam allowance with that. So we fold it and we cut triangular wedges along that curved edge in the seam allowance to create the notches to remove the excess bulk of the seam allowance when we flip that right side out with that curve. So we have little notches that we've cut out. Now we're ready to actually turn our collar right side out. So we go through the edge that we didn't sew and we turn that so that it is right side out. Okay. Then we'll take our scissors and very carefully push into the corners so that we get nice points to our collar. And just keep pushing until you can get good points in your collar. Okay. Then we will want to press that so that it lays flat. To sew the rounded collar, we're going to start at the neck, and we're just going to sew around the curved portion of the collar. When we get to the other edge, we're going to back stitch. So again, start at the neck. We're going to do a 1/4 of an inch seam allowance. So we're going to line up the edge of the fabric with the edge of the presser foot. We're going to back stitch. Then we're going to slightly turn the collar as we're sewing to keep the edge of the fabric at a 1/4 of an inch. As we sew around the outer curve of the collar. When we get to the end, we're going to back stitch and take our collar out. So we've sewn around our round collar to sew the upper collar to the lower collar. We have left the neckline seam unsewn. So now we're ready to flip the collar right side out, or turn it right side out. But what we need to do first is we need to notch this outer edge in our seam allowance, because the outer edge of the collar is actually larger in circle than where we actually have it stitched. So we need to remove some of the seam allowance so that we remove the excess bulk. So again, we're going to cut triangular wedges all the way around so that we notch out some of the seam allowance, so that when we turn it back on itself, this removes the bulk of the seam allowance. Okay, so you can see that I have triangular wedges cut around my seam allowance all the way around the seam. Now I'm ready to turn it right side out, so I'm going to go through the portion of the neck that we didn't sew, and I'm going to flip it or turn it so that it is right side out now. My seam allowances are hidden inside between my upper and my lower collar. And I want to make sure that I get that pulled nice and flat. That seam should become a fold line, so we want to make sure that we have it turned all the way out so we get a good round collar. And then we'll want to press that flat. We have our pointed collar and our round collar that we've sewn. We turned them right side out. Now we need to press those so that they lay flat, and we want to make sure that our seams become fold lines. So we want to make sure that we've got them turned out so that they become the seam. Okay, so they're nice and flat. After we've pressed our collars, we're ready to apply our collars to our actual garment. So if you look at the collars themselves, if you line up the small neckline with that, those are both the same size and shape. So with a flat collar, the neckline curve determines the type of collar it is. So that determines that it's a flat collar. It's going to lay flat against the garment. The outside edge determines what the shape of the collar is. So this is our round collar versus our pointed collar, even though they're both flat collars. So to apply our collars to our garment, we are going to take our garment, we're going to lay it flat right side up, and we're going to apply the collar matching the edges of the neck. So if we were to lay it down just like this, it doesn't lay flat. So we're going to have to actually make it fit the shape of the neckline as we pin it. So we want the center front and the edge of our collar, we want that to come straight down the center front, matching up where our notch is. And we're going to pin that. And then we are going to just lift it up slightly and make the neckline fit the shape of the collar. When we get to the center back of our garment should extend 1/4 of an inch further than our collar, because our collar's already got a finished seam, but our center back has the seam allowance left. So we're going to have about 1/4 of an inch that's going to overhang past our collar. Then we're going to work the collar in, making the neckline of the garment match the shape of the collar. When we sew, we want to make sure that our seam allowances are laying flat from where we press them open. And then we're going to do the same thing with the curved collar. So we want the straight part of the curved collar to come down center front. We're going to line up the edge of the neckline with the neck of our garment. When we get to center back, we're going to have 1/4 of an inch longer on our center back of the garment than we do of the edge of our collar. And then we're going to make the neck of the garment fit the shape of the neck of the collar. So we have our round collar pinned on one side of our garment. We have our pointed collar pinned on the other side of the garment at the neck. To sew our collar to our garment, we're going to sew around the neckline of the collar and the garment. And we are going to use a basting stitch to sew this first, because this is just to hold the collar in place, because we're going to come back and sew again when we sew the facing on that. So we're going to put our machine on the basting stitch, that's the largest stitch length, and we're going to do at 1/4 of an inch, and we're not going to back stitch because we're basting. We're going to slightly turn the garment as we sew to keep the edge of the fabric at the edge of the presser foot for our 1/4 inch. When we get to the center front, our collars should meet but not overlap as we're sewing those down. When we are sewing, we want to make sure that our shoulder seams are laying flat on the underside. And when we get to the other end, again, we're not going to back stitch because we basted that seam in. To finish the wrong side of our neckline, we're going to apply a facing. So we need to sew the back facing pieces to the front facing pieces at the shoulders. So we're going to put right sides together, and we're going to match our notches. And pin those so that we can sew the shoulders. when we have them pinned, they're not going to match up at the bottom, and that's okay because our neck in the front cuts down lower than our neck in the back. So here's the top of my neck facing for the front. Here's the back. We have a much deeper curve in the front that fits our neckline. Also, our back pieces are going to overlap, and that's okay because this is the seam allowance that would be allowed for finishing the back of the garment for our opening to be able to get that garment around the neckline. To sew the shoulder seams of the neck facing, we're going to use a 1/4 inch seam allowance. So we're going to line up the edge of the fabric with the edge of our presser foot. We're going to use a regular stitch length and a plain seam. We're going to back stitch. Then we're going to stitch across the shoulder seam. And when we get to the other side, we're going to back stitch. And we're going to do that for both of the shoulder seams on the neck facing. Again, a 1/4 inch seam allowance, the edge of the presser foot. We're going to back stitch. We're going to sew across the shoulder seam. And when we get to the other side, we're going to back stitch. We've sewn the shoulder seams of our neck facing, so now we need to open those and press them flat. We'll do that to both of the seams. We've sewn our collar to our garment with a basting stitch. Now we're ready to finish the raw edge by applying our facing. So we're going to lay our facing right side down on top of our collar, and we are going to match up the center back of the facing to the center back of the garment. And we're lining up the edge at the neck. We want the seam, our shoulder seams should match, and our notches should match as well as we go around the neckline. The other side, again, we're going to match up the center back of the facing to the center back of the garment. And our shoulder seams should match. And then we should match our notches in the front. Alright, so we should have our facing pinned on to our garment. So we should have the garment, then we should have the collar, then we should have the facing, and the facing should be facing right side, should be facing to the collar itself. We should be able to see the inner facing on the facing. To sew the facing on, we're going to sew at a 1/4 inch. So the edge of the neckline should be at the edge of the presser foot. We're going to use a regular stitch length, so make sure that you set your machine back to regular stitch length from the basting. And we're going to back stitch and then sew around the neck. When we get to the other end, we will back stitch. So again, we're going to very carefully turn the fabric slightly as we're stitching to keep it the edge of the fabric at the edge of the presser foot for our 1/4 of an inch seam allowance. We also want to make sure that we keep our shoulder seam allowances open flat as we're sewing. Get to the other center back, we're going to back stitch. We have our facing sewn to our collar and to our garment. Now we need to notch around the neck seam allowance so that it will lay smooth when we turn the facing to the inside of the garment. So we've notched the inside of that so that we can reduce some of the bulk. We can also then go in and just clip that because we're going to want that seam to spread a little bit too. So we can just go in and slightly cut in through the seam allowance up to the seam but not through, so that we are allowing the seam allowance to be able to spread open when it turns back. So we're going to allow it to be able to spread open as we turn the facing into the wrong side of the garment. So we're going to want to now turn the facing so that it's on the inside of the garment, and we're going to press that. We need to turn the facing to the inside of the garment and press that so it stays down. So I like to actually just lay the facing out flat first and press so that I get a good, nice, flat surface at the seam itself, because my seam is going to become my fold line. And now I'm ready to then fold the facing to the wrong side of the garment using my neckline seam as my fold. We want to make sure we get that so it's a good, nice fold there. And then that's your collar. When it goes around the neck, it turns and it'll fold back so that the center backs will meet, and you'll have a slight opening in the front for the collar. If you have a little bit of your basting stitch showing, you can take that basting stitch out so that it doesn't show.